On September 17, 1916, at 11 o'clock in the morning, Lieutenant Manfred von Richthofen flew in formation with 19 other Albatros fighters of the newly formed Jasta II, led by the legendary Oswald Bolk. It was the unit's first full mission. They had spotted a British formation returning from a bombing run. Richthofen was only 24 years old and had just transferred from the cavalry to aviation. His reputation as a pilot was terrible. During training, Richthofen had crashed on his first solo flight. His instructors considered him a below-average pilot, with clumsy controls and lacking flying finesse. His colleagues mocked him. But that morning, something would change. Richthofen dove on a British F.E.2B biplane, closing to just 10 meters. His heart raced. He fired several machine gun bursts. The enemy engine stopped, and the aircraft began to fall. Captain Tom Rees continued shooting until he was killed by Richthofen's fire. Lieutenant Lionel Morris managed to land the damaged aircraft near a German airfield but died en route to the hospital. Richthofen landed next to the wreckage. It was his first confirmed victory. 79 others would follow. What no one knew at that moment was that this clumsy pilot would become the greatest combat ace in aviation history. But there was a fundamental problem that plagued Richthofen. In November 1916, after shooting down his 11th plane, he faced the British Captain Lano Hawker, one of the Royal Flying Corps' top aces. Richthofen flew an Albatros D.2, while Hawker piloted the older DH.2. After a long dogfight in increasingly tight circles, Hawker was shot in the back of the head as he tried to escape. Richthofen noted in his diary that Hawker was the British Bulk. But the combat had exposed a critical weakness. His Albatros was fast but not sufficiently agile. In close dogfights, maneuverability was more important than speed. Richthofen became convinced he needed an aircraft with more agility, even if it meant losing speed. An idea began to germinate in his mind. In January 1917, after downing his 16th enemy plane, Richthofen received command of Jasta 11 in Germany's most prestigious military medal, the Pour le Mérite, known as the Blue Max. To celebrate, he made a decision that shocked everyone. He ordered his Albatros D.3 to be painted brilliant red. Completely red. His superiors thought he had gone insane. He was making himself a perfect target. But Richthofen wasn't seeking invisibility. He was cultivating fear. He wanted his enemies to know who was coming. Allied pilots began to dread the appearance of that red aircraft in the skies. The Germans called him der Rote Kampfflieger, the Red Battle Flyer. The Allies christened him the Red Baron. Under his command, Jasta 11 became one of the deadliest units of the war. In April 1917, a month that became known as Bloody April, Richthofen's pilots shot down 89 British planes in the Battle of Arras. Richthofen personally destroyed 22 of them, including 4 in a single day. But something was on the horizon that would change everything. In February 1917, a new British plane had appeared over the Western Front. The Sopwith triplane. Despite having only one Vickers machine gun, the Sopwith triplane quickly proved superior to the more heavily armed Albatros fighters used by the German Luftstreitkräfte. Anthony Fokker, the Dutch designer who built planes for the Germans, was fascinated when he saw a captured Sopwith triplane in April 1917. He immediately returned to his factory in Schwerin and ordered engineer Reinhold Platz to build a triplane. He gave no further instructions. Platz responded with the V.4, a small triplane powered by a rotary engine. Initial tests revealed unacceptably high control forces. Fokker then produced the V.5, with horn-balanced ailerons and elevators. On July 14, 1917, the German War Ministry ordered 20 pre-production aircraft. The Fokker Dr. I had been born. Dr. I stood for Dreidecker, three-winger in German. But when the first triplanes arrived at the front, Allied pilots laughed. The Fokker Dr. I was significantly smaller than other fighters, measuring only 5.77 meters long with a 7.19 meter wingspan. And it wasn't as fast as most planes, with a top speed of only 185 kilometers per hour, 115 miles per hour. The British thought it was a joke. Until Werner Voss, a 20-year-old German ace, showed what the aircraft could do. Flying a prototype, Voss shot down 10 British planes in 6 days of air combat in September 1917. But it was his last battle that went down in history. Voss single-handedly faced 8 British fighters for several minutes, spinning and turning with incredible speed before finally being shot down. The British pilots who killed him described the experience as terrifying. The triplane wasn't fast, but it climbed like a monkey and was maneuverable as the devil. Richthofen was fascinated. This was exactly the kind of aircraft he was looking for. In July 1917, he began flying the Fokker F-I prototype, achieving 2 victories. When the improved Dr. I version arrived in November, with reinforced wings, he adopted it immediately. He painted it red, of course. His unit, now expanded to Jägerschwader I, a combat wing with 4 squadrons, became known as the Flying Circus. The name came from the brightly painted aircraft and the unit's mobility, as it moved quickly along the front using tents and trains. Each pilot painted his plane uniquely. One looked like a chessboard with black and white squares. Another was entirely sky blue. One had a dragon's head and large eyes painted on the engine cowling. Richthofen's red triplane had become the most feared symbol of aerial warfare. But the Dr. I had a deadly secret. On October 29, 1917, Lieutenant Heinrich Gonnermann was performing acrobatics when his triplane disintegrated in the air. He died in the ensuing forced landing. 2 days later, Lieutenant Gunther Pastor of Jasta 11 was killed when his triplane broke apart in level flight. Inspection of the wreckage showed defective construction. Lack of weatherproofing allowed moisture to damage the wing structure. On November 2, the German War Ministry grounded all remaining triplanes. Fokker was forced to improve quality control, reinforce the rib structures, and varnish the spars. Even after the corrections, the triplanes continued to suffer from wing failures. But Richthofen trusted the plane. It was the perfect tool for his tactics. He wasn't an acrobatic pilot like his brother Lothar or like Werner Voss. He was a calculated tactician. He never took unnecessary risks. He would dive from above to attack with the advantage of the sun at his back, while other pilots in his squadron covered his rear and flanks. He aimed first for the pilot's head, or the observer if there was one. He was a deadly shot, a skill he had developed hunting in his youth. To mark his growing victories, he commissioned a German jeweler to craft small silver goblets. Each one bore the date of an air victory. By the summer of 1917, Richthofen's collection already numbered 57 goblets. But his luck was running out. On July 6, 1917, during a dogfight over France, he was hit by a bullet fired from a British biplane. The projectile grazed his head and fractured his skull, temporarily blinding and paralyzing him. Richthofen managed to regain consciousness and make a forced landing behind German lines. The wound left him with recurring headaches, nausea, and episodes of depression. His doctors ordered prolonged rest. He refused. Ignoring medical orders, Richthofen returned to active duty in mid-August. He quickly switched to the Fokker Dr. I, the machine that would become his most iconic aircraft. In the following months, the Bloody Red Baron used the highly maneuverable triplane to wreak devastation among the Allies. But something had changed. Some historians believe the head injury impaired his judgment. Others think he had simply become too confident. On April 20, 1918, during an air combat, Richthofen shot down 2 Sopwith Camels in 3 minutes, marking his 79th and 80th victories. The next day, April 21, his cousin Wolfram von Richthofen joined them on his first mission. Being a novice, Richthofen ordered his cousin to stay out of the combat, circling above the battle just observing. Around 11 a.m., Richthofen's planes encountered Squadron 209 of the Royal Air Force, commanded by Captain Roy Brown. Lieutenant Wilfred May, also a novice, had received similar orders from Brown. May saw Wolfram's plane alone and decided to attack it. Richthofen looked up, saw his cousin under attack, and immediately flew to rescue him, firing at May and forcing him away from the combat. But this time, Richthofen broke his own rules. He flew too low. He followed too far behind enemy lines. Chasing May over the Somme River, Richthofen was struck by a single shot. The debate over who fired the fatal shot persists to this day. Some credit Captain Roy Brown, who had dived to assist May. Others believe it came from ground fire from Australian machine gunners. Richthofen managed to make a controlled landing in a field, but he was dead when Australian troops reached him. He was only 25 years old. He had flown in combat for just over 2 years, but his 80 confirmed victories remained unmatched. Allied troops recovered his body and buried him with full military honors. A British officer wrote, "The funeral of Captain Baron von Richthofen yesterday afternoon was a simple but impressive ceremony." The coffin, borne by 6 Royal Air Force officers, was laid to rest in a corner of the French cemetery. The English service was read and the last salute fired over the grave. A propeller formed the tombstone. Souvenir hunters tore apart his red aircraft. Pieces of the fabric, the wood, even the buttons of his uniform were taken as trophies. What happened to the Fokker Doctor I triplane that so many had mocked? Only 320 were built throughout the war, a tiny number compared to the thousands of camels and Spads produced. But its impression on aviation history was, and remains, deep and lasting. Ironically, Richthofen achieved only 19 of his 80 victories in the red triplane, despite the strong association between him and the aircraft. His first 17 victories were in the Albatros D.2. He also flew the Albatros D.3 and D.V, as well as the Halberstadt D.2. But it was the triplane that captured the world's imagination. No original Doctor I survived. The last one, serial 152 of 17, in which Richthofen achieved 3 victories, was on display at the Zughaus Museum in Berlin. It was destroyed in an Allied bombing raid during World War II. Today, only a few original Doctor I artifacts survive in museums, but countless replicas have been built. General George Patton wrote that a new form of warfare would have to be created. German Admiral Erich Ludendorff commented that Richthofen was worth as much as 3 divisions. But perhaps the Red Baron's most lasting legacy is another. In a war that had become mechanized, brutal, and devoid of honor, Richthofen represented a fleeting ideal that there could still be chivalry, skill, and even beauty in battle. He was the first great ace of modern warfare. Decades after World War I, some authors question whether Richthofen had actually achieved 80 victories, hinting that his record was exaggerated for propaganda purposes. But Richthofen's records are unusually well documented. A study published in 1998 by British historian Norman Franks and colleagues concluded that there was a high degree of accuracy in Richthofen's claimed victories. 73 of the 80 listed correspond to recorded British losses, with details of the RFC/RAF squadron, aircraft serial numbers, and identities of the airmen killed or captured. There were also unconfirmed victories that would place his actual total at 100 or more. The plane that his enemies mocked, saying it was too small, too slow, just a joke, became the most iconic symbol of World War I aviation. And the pilot whom everyone considered below average, the clumsy cavalryman who crashed on his first solo flight, became the greatest combat ace in history. More than a century later, his red triplane still casts a long shadow over the history of flight.